this broad, sweeping law, significant changes for the health care of all Americans, how it is, in my opinion, bad for patients, bad for providers, the nurses and doctors who take care of them, and bad for our taxpayers. With that, Madam President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Mr. President, I ask that proceedings under the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I also ask unanimous consent that my entire statement be submitted for the record.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak to the proceedings that have just occurred in this body with regard to ethanol and to talk about how I see them from the perspective of my home state of Delaware. Today, the Senate agreed on a path forward to end federal subsidies for corn-based ethanol. And as senators, we are often asked to make tough choices. And the votes on today's amendments, the bipartisan votes on today's amendments, were largely a reflection of where we're from. For Delaware, agriculture is the single largest part of our economy. We grow a lot of corn, we grow a lot of soybeans, we have companies investing in advanced biofuels, and we have a major poultry industry. And today, I voted for Delaware's poultry growers and for our consumers. Lots of folks across this country in the last few years have lost their jobs, lost their homes, lost their livelihoods. And it is, to me, very important that the people of Delaware know on the record that the vote that I cast today to end federal subsidies for ethanol was about voting to make sure that we are supporting our home state poultry industry. My main concerns are that one of the most important economic engines, not just in Delaware but on the whole Delmarva Peninsula, is the poultry industry, an industry that has its back against the wall and is struggling to survive. At a time when many other ag industries are seeing record prices, and that is a positive thing, a boon for them, for the poultry industry, the rising cost of feed is forcing decades-old companies to rethink their business models, or, sadly, in one case just last week, one of the most important and vital poultry companies in Delaware shut its doors and went into bankruptcy. We need to move away from corn-based ethanol and towards homegrown advanced biofuels if we are going to accomplish three goals at the same time. One is to reduce our deficit, to end unwise and unnecessary federal spending. Second is to support and advance and defend our poultry industry, whether in Delmarva or throughout the rest of the country. And third is to continue to move, to make progress towards the future of clean, promising biofuels that are not from grain. The amendment I just voted for closes the door on corn-based ethanol. But in my view, that should not prevent us from finding a path forward to advanced biofuels, those not from grain, whether cellulosic ethanol or drop-in biofuels developed from algae or otherwise. Today, I also filed an amendment with Senator Carper, the senior senator from Delaware, that makes it clear that as we close the door on corn-based ethanol, we need to do two other things going forward. First, use those billions of dollars in savings to reduce the deficit. And second, redirect funds formerly committed to VTEC to support an important but just beginning, a nascent advanced biofuels industry. Ultimately, the policies we pursue should lead to American consumers, producers, and farmers using less petroleum and, more importantly, using less oil from overseas sources. If we are going to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, and especially on those that we import from overseas, we're going to need to continue to pursue a range of cleaner and more secure sources of energy. Advanced biofuels are central to this effort. And now that we have taken the important first step by adopting the Feinstein-Coburn Amendment and signaling the intent of this body to end federal subsidies for corn-based ethanol, I hope that we will also responsibly pay down our federal deficit and continue a strong path forward towards the advanced biofuels that Delawareans are making a significant contribution towards making a reality. Mr. President, thank you very much, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, our nation's challenges grow day by day. The citizens of Utah get this. The citizens of this country get this. The recent NBC News Wall Street Journal poll found that 62% of Americans think the country is on the wrong track. Only 37% of Americans approve of the President's job of handling the economy. I would like to meet those people, because when I talk to Utahns, the numbers are much lower than that. And I understand why. Applications for unemployment have been above 400,000 for 7 straight weeks. Economic growth is stagnant. Job growth is pathetic. The real estate market remains in free fall. Since 2007, housing values have dropped by more than during the Great Depression. Medicare is going bankrupt, and when it does, it will take down this country and tens of millions of seniors with it. Yet President Obama and his Democratic allies steadfastly refuse to acknowledge that there's a problem with Medicare. Former Speaker Nancy Pelosi, when asked where the Democrats' reform plan was, responded, quote, "We have a plan. It's called Medicare," unquote. Meanwhile, the President's hand-picked chairwoman of the Democratic National Committee gleefully demagogues Republicans' efforts to fix this dying program. There are legitimate fears that the Federal Reserve's loose money policy is creating yet another stock market bubble that could pop and destroy the retirement savings of millions of Americans. And most ominously, PIMCO, the world's largest bond fund manager, is looking to countries like Australia, Canada, Brazil, and Mexico, countries without our massive fiscal problems, to invest in. As I've said before, there is a genuine risk that the United States is in a debt bubble. Because of historically low interest rates, we may be totally underestimating how dangerously leveraged this country is. But the minute that rates start going up, citizens are going to realize how much they are really on the hook for. And when the word on the street is that U.S. Treasuries are not worth investing in, higher interest rates are just around the corner. So we have a lot of work to do. But I want to touch on 3 things that we should be doing now, and I mean right now. The people are demanding action, and there are a few things that Congress can do today that would bring relief to struggling American families. First, the President needs to submit the Colombia, Panama, and South Korean free trade agreements to Congress. They are long overdue. The failure to submit these agreements has stalled U.S. job growth at a time when it is desperately needed. There is only upside to these agreements. Consider that from Utah alone, South Korea imported more than $294 million of goods in 2009. The former director of the Congressional Budget Office, Doug Holtz-Eakin, has it right. This is what he said earlier this week in a letter to the President. Quote, "Opening Colombia, South Korea, and Panama to U.S. businesses is anticipated to increase total exports by $12 billion and will add at least $14 billion to the United States gross domestic product, promoting increased investment and job creation at home, unquote. And when the President's down in Florida yucking it up with rich liberals about how he wasted nearly $1 trillion on his stimulus boondoggle, he seems oblivious to the fact that he could deliver these agreements to Congress and have a trade-driven economic stimulus. If given a clean up or down vote, I am confident that these agreements would pass. I have no doubt who will prevail if that debate were allowed to happen. But old habits die hard. The President's spend-first mentality is cluttering up what should be a clean debate on the benefit of these three trade agreements for the American economy. Rumors persist that the President may include a reauthorization of the expanded Trade Adjustment Assistance Bill into one or perhaps all of the bills implementing our trade agreements with Colombia, Panama, and South Korea. This would be a grave mistake. That tactic raises serious procedural concerns which could jeopardize approval of these job-creating agreements. It also raises serious concerns about the President's commitment to gaining approval of our long-stalled trade agreements with these important allies. It would send a signal that further placating unions is more important than growing our economy, a position that I simply cannot understand or support. If the President chooses this course of action, he needs to know that I will vigorously oppose him and reserve the right to use all procedural options available to do so. If, as the President says, there is such strong bipartisan support for trade adjustment assistance, it should be considered on its own merits and not thrust upon an unwilling Congress through procedural shenanigans. These trade agreements are something that Washington can do and should do to get our economy back on track. But we must also be vigilant in fighting against proposals that would undermine our economy and our sovereignty. Standard & Poor's recently downgraded Greece's debt rating to CCC from a B. This is the world's lowest rating. And S&P concluded that a default on Greek debt was increasingly likely. And so what was the President's response? Like the sirens call, a bailout beckoned. He seemed to go all in for an IMF bailout of Greece. Greece has already been bailed out once by the IMF to the tune of $145 billion. We cannot let this happen again. And that is why today I am co-sponsoring the anti-IMF bailout amendment with my good friends Senators DeMint, Vitter, and Cornyn. This amendment, which we filed to the Economic Development Revitalization Act, would rescind bailout funds provided in 2009 to the International Monetary Fund. Under the urging of the Obama administration, additional funding of up to $108 billion was given to the IMF, which it can use to bail out heavily indebted European countries like Greece. Now, the amendment I'm co-sponsoring would roll that funding back. Now is not the time when Americans are struggling to find work and have budget problems of their own to tap innocent American taxpayers in order to bail out profligate European governments. Rather, it is time to stop our own runaway spending and our continued movement toward European levels of government. If we go down that route, the destination is an America very different than the one our founders intended. And it is critical that we hit the brakes now and save our limited constitutional government. The American people are tired of bailouts. When ordinary Americans are struggling to get by and when our country faces its own debt crisis, the last thing we need is a bailout of irresponsible socialist governments and the irresponsible investors who bet on them. Which brings me to my final point. Earlier this week, my colleague and friend from Florida, Senator Marco Rubio, gave his maiden speech in the Senate. He is certainly to be commended. I sat here and listened to it. It was a tour de force. And I recommend that all of my colleagues, and for that matter, all of the citizens of this nation, read it. He made it clear that he is confident in this nation and our ability to weather the current storm and emerge in rich and steady seas. America's best days are ahead of it. America has been and will always be a shining city on the hill. But for there to be another American century, a century of liberty and prosperity both here and abroad, we have our work cut out for us. America is over $14 trillion in debt, actually 14.5. We face our third year of trillion-dollar deficits. We have entitlement programs that are going bankrupt. Under this presidency, we have lifted the debt ceiling 3 times. And the last one, if I recall it correctly, was about $1.9 trillion. And we've basically just given Congress and the administration, we've basically given the administration an open checkbook to write checks. We have entitlement programs that are going bankrupt. Our total obligations, according to one account, are over $62 trillion. This is a debt burden that is simply unsustainable. We need to get our spending under control immediately. Otherwise, American families and businesses will be crushed under the weight of all this debt. The other side keeps telling us the problem is the lack of revenue. They say all we need to do is raise taxes and eliminate tax loopholes. Never mind the fact that raising taxes threatens to kill the small businesses that will be the engines of our economic recovery. And never mind the fact that these so-called loopholes include the IRAs, 401ks, and charitable deductions of American taxpayers. Let's not make any bones about it. The left's proposal to gut tax expenditures would put a bullseye on the back of working families that have mortgages and save for the future. And in the spirit of bipartisanship, as an aside to some of my friends on my side of the aisle who seem to think all tax expenditures are wasteful spending, consider the following. The third largest tax expenditure is the current lower rates for capital gains and dividends. Be careful, my friends. Otherwise, you might inadvertently find yourselves sharing the stage with my friend, the junior senator from Vermont, in effect advocating for a sharp hike in the rates on capital gains and dividends. Even if liberal Democrats did all of these things, raising taxes on middle Americans and further hindering economic growth, we still would come nowhere close to balancing the budget. This is the dirty secret about the failure of President Obama and Democratic leadership to engage in meaningful efforts to balance the budget. As my colleague from Alabama the ranking member of the Senate Budget Committee, notes, it has been more than 770 days since Democrats passed a budget. That's disgraceful. For over 2 years, congressional Democrats have simply abdicated their most basic constitutional responsibility. And here's why. They refuse to cut spending, and they know that balancing the budget through new taxes alone would be received as a full-blown assault on personal liberty and limited government. So instead of offering up a bogus budget, as the president did, and get laughed out of town, or offering up a proposal for balance that satisfies their liberal base, raises the tax burden to historic levels, and inspires the vitriol of their constituents, Democrats decide to keep their mouths shut. So where does that leave us? The answer to me is clear. We need to pass a balanced budget constitutional amendment. This is where the entire Republican caucus stands in the Senate. The amendment that I introduced, S.J. Res. 10, is supported by every single Senate Republican. I believe it's the first time that all Republican senators have supported it. It is a good amendment that benefited from the input of many senators, and it is a necessary amendment. Some people, the sophisticated set, argue that this is not a serious proposal. Well, the American people beg to differ. They know that Congress will not balance the budget and shrink the size of government without meaningful constitutional restraints. The actions of Democrats and President Obama over the last few months are all the evidence we need to support this hypothesis. Facing a full-blown debt crisis, they still prefer to kick the spending can down the road. I want to be clear that I am deadly serious about this proposal, and so are the people of Utah. I've been pleased to work side by side with my colleague from Utah, Senator Mike Lee, on the balanced budget amendment, and Senator Cornyn, and all the other Republicans. Some people might say that Mike Lee and I are an odd couple. I have a few years on him, and I don't intend to be as animated as he is. He's a great young man with a lot of energy. But we share at least one thing, an absolute commitment to passing a balanced budget constitutional amendment and sending it to the people in the states for ratification. The people are demanding that we act, and it's well past time that we recognize their constitutional sovereignty and allow them to exercise it through state ratifying conventions. I would like to commend Senator Lee for his tireless work on this amendment. He is not the only one who deserves thanks, however. My colleagues, Senators Cornyn, Kyle, Toomey, DeMint, Rubio, Paul, and all the other Republicans were all essential in the development of this amendment. But it really is special for me to be working with my friend Senator Lee on this critical constitutional amendment. He is a legitimate constitutional scholar, a steadfast advocate of our constitutionally limited government, and a hero to many, and I could not be prouder to stand with him and lead this fight for the people of Utah and the taxpayers of this country. If the American people said anything last fall, it is that they want their representatives in Washington to listen to them. They know that we won't get it right every time, but they know that we should always do our best to represent their values and their interests. This Congress needs to listen to the people. It needs to get these trade agreements done without holding them hostage to unrelated spending. It needs to say no to more bailouts, and it needs to pass a balanced budget constitutional amendment. In this country, the people are sovereign. I'd have to say, if we would pass that constitutional amendment through the Senate, I believe we'd get it through the House, and then it's up to the states. You still have to get three-quarters of the states to ratify it, and to the extent that Democrats hate the constitutional amendment and hate that kind of restraint on their spending practices, they can lead the battle in the states. The problem is they know that this constitutional amendment would be ratified so fast our heads would be spinning. You need 38 states to ratify a constitutional amendment, and that's not easy under anybody's view. In this country, let's let the people decide that. They are sovereign. It is well past time that Congress and the President listen to them. Mr. President, I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Consent the quorum call be suspended.
Without objection.
And consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, like yourself, I've served both in the House of Representatives and the United States Senate, and during the course of my career I've been called on to make many votes. Most of them fade into obscurity after they are cast and are never recalled again, but there are a few that you'll remember for a lifetime. And I would say that at the highest level in that category are the times when we are called upon as members of Congress to consider a declaration of war. Many of us have lost sleep over those decisions, thought about those votes long and hard. No matter how just the war may be or how important it may be, you cannot help but reflect on the fact that at the end of the day, people will die as a result of your decision if you go forward in terms of a declaration of war. And I've lost sleep over those decisions. I've tried to, during the course of making those decisions, be guided by several principles. First, as members of the Congress, both in the House and the Senate, we swear to uphold and defend the Constitution. And I've felt that that Constitution is my starting point for my responsibility and my rights as a member of the United States Senate when it comes to this issue. The Constitution is very clear in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, that only the Congress can declare war. The decision was made by our founding fathers that the people of the United States, literally, would have a voice in this decision. It wouldn't be a decision made only by the chief executive, because ultimately the people and their families and their children would pay the price of a war. In human terms, the loss of life, and of course in the cost of that war that is borne by our nation. I also am guided by my responsibility to the people who were kind enough to give me this opportunity to serve. I think about my state of Illinois and the families, the mothers, fathers, and children all across that state who could be affected by a decision if our nation goes to war. I also like to think in terms of whether the war is absolutely necessary in terms of the defense of the United States of America. Some cases are easier calls. When we were attacked on 9/11, many of us knew that 3,000 innocent Americans had died at the hands of terrorists. I didn't hesitate to vote for a declaration of war against those forces in Afghanistan responsible for that attack on the United States. We went through a parallel debate at the same time about the invasion of Iraq. I didn't believe that the previous president had made a compelling case for the invasion of Iraq. If you'll recall, at the time, the debate was about weapons of mass destruction that could threaten the Middle East or even the United States. I voted against that declaration of war in Iraq. 23 of us did in the Senate, 22 Democrats and 1 Republican. We came to learn that there were no weapons of mass destruction. Many of the threats which gave rise to the President's request turned out to not be factual at all. Well, we are finally, more than 10 years later, starting to bring those troops home from Iraq, and we paid a heavy price in Americans killed and maimed and in the cost to our nation. So each time that we have been challenged as a Senate and the House to consider a declaration of war, I have thought long and hard about it. My constitutional responsibilities, my responsibilities to the people of my state, and whether such a war was absolutely necessary. Now we are engaged in 3 wars. Wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and in Libya. And shortly we will be considering the authority of the President of the United States to continue our involvement in Libya. I am going to apply the same standard, constitutional standard, and standards of judgment to that decision that I have to every other declaration of war or every other approval of hostilities by the United States, engagement in hostilities, as I have in the past. This President is my friend. He was my colleague in the Senate. We are of the same political party, but when it comes to an issue of this gravity, we have to move beyond any personal considerations when it comes to the President and think about our nation, our Constitution, and our responsibility to the people that we represent. We have learned during the course of our history that presidents don't always come to Congress when they initiate a war. President Franklin Roosevelt did. Came to Congress shortly after, in fact, the day after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and asked for the authority and permission to go forward with a war that would be waged against those who had attacked us. And then came the Korean conflict, which was not characterized in official terms as a war because President Truman didn't come to Congress asking for that authority. I had 2 brothers, incidentally, who served in the United States Navy during the Korean conflict. They always used to say jokingly it was a police action with real bullets. And I know because many innocent Americans died in the course of that Korean conflict, yet there was no formal declaration of war. Vietnam was a war that I paid much closer attention to because it came at a time when I was in college and law school and my friends were being asked to serve. Again, there was no official declaration of war. After Vietnam and after the tremendous loss of life and all the controversy associated with it, there was a debate in the halls of Congress about whether or not we needed to be more specific in terms of the authority of a president to go to war. And so Congress enacted the War Powers Resolution in the 1970s, which spelled out in specific terms the responsibility of the president when he would ask this nation to go to war. That bill, having passed both the House and Senate, was sent to President Nixon, who vetoed it. He viewed it, as most presidents have then and since, as an intrusion on his authority as Commander-in-Chief. But the Congress decided to pass the War Powers Resolution over the veto of President Nixon, reaffirming the constitutional authority and right of Congress when it came to a declaration of war. And so now we find ourselves in a situation where Congress has voted on going forward with the war in Iraq, and as I mentioned earlier, I was one of those who voted against it. Going forward with the war in Afghanistan, I was one who voted for it. All senators did, I might add, of both political parties. And now a question of Libya. Several months ago, the situation in Libya became so grave that the President of the United States met with our leaders in the military and leaders of other nations to ask what should be done. Muammar Gaddafi, the rogue leader of Libya, was literally attacking and killing his own people in the streets of his country. And there was a widespread public reaction against it from the Arab League, of which Libya was a member, as well as the European Union, the United Nations, and others. President Obama made the decision then to consult with members of Congress about what we should do. I was fortunate enough, being a member of leadership, to be part of the conference call when the President was on the line with leaders, Democrats and Republicans, and the House and Senate, in the House and Senate, and spelled out what he believed was the grave threat to the innocent people of Libya. At that point, there was a question as to whether or not Benghazi was going to fall and whether Muammar Gaddafi would consolidate power and take retribution against those who had been in opposition to his government. He said that he was going to take to the streets with his military and kill them like rats. And we took him at his word. And the President felt that the civilized nations of the world had to act. Acting in consultation and in concert with the Arab League and the United Nations and NATO, the President spelled out a course of action. He told us in these early consultations that the United States' involvement would be very limited, perhaps more intense at the outset than as any conflict progressed, and that we would not commit land troops to Libya, and that basically the leadership of this effort would be under the auspices of NATO, and we would be in a supportive role, a role which would diminish over time. That was the President's promise, and that was what was executed. Now, more than 2 months later, the question has arisen, well, what is this President's responsibility under the Constitution? What is the Congress's responsibility under the Constitution? Are we engaged in a war? I might say that I sat down before coming to the floor and carefully reread the War Powers Resolution. And although we characterize it in many different ways, the language of this War Powers Resolution is in some areas difficult to apply to every situation. It makes reference throughout to the introduction of United States armed forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by the circumstances, and to the continued use of such forces in hostilities or in such situations. We translate that in our debates, and I've been party to many over the course of the time that I've served in the House and the Senate, as to whether we are talking about a defensive military action or an offensive military action. I don't think there is any question, not in my mind, that a president as commander-in-chief has the authority, without seeking congressional approval, to defend the people of the United States and its territory. Certainly, we wouldn't expect the president to wait for Congress to convene, debate, and vote if the United States and its citizens are under attack. But what of those other circumstances where we are initiating military action that is not strictly in defense of the United States? Are those so-called offensive military actions hostilities? Do they require a president to come forward and to ask of Congress authority to go forward with those, the U.S. involvement in those military hostilities? And that is where we find ourselves today. More than 60 days after the initiation of our involvement in Libya, the debate is still on in the United States Senate as to whether or not we need to authorize the president to continue our efforts in Libya and whether that authorization should be under the War Powers Resolution. I think it should, and that's why I've come to the floor today. I joined with Senator Ben Cardin in introducing a proposal, Senate Joint Resolution, which we've circulated, which would give the president the authority, if passed, to continue the hostilities in Libya under the War Powers Resolution, expressly stating that it would not involve land forces, ground troops, and that it would have a time certain to end. In our case, by the end of this calendar year, subject to another decision by Congress as to whether or not it should go forward. Now, I believe that that is still the right course of action, and I am hopeful that before the end of the day, there will be action taken by some of my colleagues here in Congress to come forward with a bipartisan resolution which parallels what I've just described. I might add that there is some controversy, and it is worthy of at least debate as to our current situation in Libya and whether it fits squarely within the War Powers Resolution. Bob Bauer, who is General Counsel to the President of the United States, argues it does not. Yesterday, in a conference call, Mr. Bauer was asked specifically whether he thought the War Powers Resolution was applicable to the current situation in Libya. And here is what he said, and I quote, and when he was asked, could you explain? He says, certainly. As I mentioned, as my colleague was going through the nature of the mission and how it changed, we're now in a position where we're operating in a support role. We're not engaged in any of the activities that typically over the years in war powers analysis is considered to constitute hostilities within the meaning of the statute. We're not engaged in sustained fighting. There's been no exchange of fire with hostile forces. We don't have troops on the ground. We don't risk casualties to those troops. None of the factors, frankly speaking, more broadly, has risked the sort of escalation that Congress was concerned would impinge on its war-making power. So within the precedents of a war powers analysis, all of which typically are very fact-dependent, we are confident that we're operating consistent with the resolution. That doesn't mean that we don't want the full ongoing consultation with Congress or authorization as we move forward, but that doesn't go to our legal position under the statute itself, and we're confident of that. I respect Mr. Bauer, but I respectfully disagree with him. I believe that what we are engaged in Libya is a matter that should come under the War Powers Resolution. I believe that we should, as a Congress, consider it under the War Powers Resolution. Now, I think that is the right course of action. It will give the President clear authority, and it will also establish the clear authority of Congress in this particular situation. Let me add quickly, I think the President was right in what he did initially. I believe that the use of American military technology, which was primarily our initial investment, was certainly warranted. Working with NATO, we created an atmosphere where the NATO forces could not be in harm's way, would be safe in their early efforts to stop Muammar Gaddafi in his efforts to kill the civilians in his country. I also believe the President was right from a foreign policy viewpoint by not doing this unilaterally, but working with the Arab League, the European Union, and the United Nations. The fact that we have, for the first time in history, NATO forces working in concert with the Arab League is, I think, a very positive thing. and I salute the President for doing it. I think his goal and motives were good in this effort, and I would vote, if asked, to continue this effort under the War Powers Act affirmatively, based on all the briefings that I've received. Having said that, I believe that we should pursue the course that Senator Cardin and I suggested in our resolution, that we should, in fact, deal with this matter under the War Powers Resolution. We should debate and take action on it here in the United States Senate, and I am hopeful that soon, perhaps before the end of the day, there will be some effort underway on a bipartisan fashion to do just that. Mr. President, at the end of the day, we will be asked by future generations if we kept truth to our oath under the Constitution, which requires us to face difficult debates and decision, and there are none more difficult than this. We are also going to be asked by the people we represent in terms of the cost in human life and the cost to American taxpayers, whether we engaged in the debate and determined that it was the appropriate thing to do. I have, like so many members of the Senate and Congress, had the sad duty to attend the funerals of those who have fallen in combat in service of our country. It is sad to face their families and realize that they have paid the ultimate sacrifice to our nation. I think that requires us, even in circumstances where the facts are debatable, to err on the side of exercising our constitutional authority. I hope before the end of the day that this bipartisan resolution will come to the floor, and certainly before the end of the week, and that we debate it and act on it before the end of this work period. Again, let me make it clear, I think the President is right in what he's doing, but I think we have a responsibility that goes beyond Mr. Byers' conclusion, a responsibility to decide that this offensive use of military force, even for good purpose, good humanitarian purpose, is one that requires the authorization of the American people through their members of Congress. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of quorum.